Welcome to the Atlanta Soto Zen Center. This is Saturday night. There's a song about that, I think. I drive here from my home about 3 miles away on Highland Avenue. This is Virginia Highlands. It's a very popular part of Atlanta for those of you who are familiar with Atlanta. Some of you are not. And it's always a parking lot. This time a fire engine came roaring through and people are all over the street. Not only Saturday in Atlanta, but it's also Gay Pride Week. And so I had to deliver some art to the gallery for a show starting next Friday. And I could not even cross 10th Street to get to the west side of town of the city because 10th Street is blocked off. Piedmont Park is a big party going on. The contrast is always wonderful. Driving through one of the most dense neighborhoods in the city, all the uproar, hubbub going on all the time, all the bars and stores and things are on that strip. And then I arrive here and it's quiet, it's empty. And the contrast is in itself very wonderful teaching. So tonight, what I'm going to do, a little bit lighter weight maybe than what's been done so far. Occasionally, I may be able to tie something that we're looking at from Uchiyama Roshi or Matsuoka Roshi back to some understanding of Dharma, something that I might want to reinforce. But mainly what I would like to do is expose you to a dozen or so comments or quotes from Uchiyama Roshi and another dozen or so from Matsuoka Roshi. We'll do Uchiyama first, and I'm not going to try to cross compare the quotes, although some of them are connected, at least in my mind. I just want to continue what we've been doing is try to give you a flavor of who these two geniuses of Zen were, pioneer in the case of Matsuoka coming to America, and how they were so alike but so different. A good example of harmony is sameness and difference, Sandokai. And I think one of the messages you probably have been getting by now is that's the way it is. And all of our practice is going to be necessarily the same, quote unquote, and necessarily totally different. When you sit in the Zendo and you look around, you have 15 or 20 people here on a weekend or more. They all seem to be doing the same thing. But no two of them are doing the same thing. So this is one of the apparent dichotomies. Matsuoka Roshi, one of his frequent quotes was, "There is no dichotomy in Zen." So you'd have to ask, where does the dichotomy lie? So with that, I'm going to jump into Kosho Uchiyama's text. This is again the commentary on 3 fascicles of Master Dogen that we are reviewing on Tuesday night. We will be continuing into November, so you're welcome to join us. It's a non-linear approach. You don't have to read the book from the beginning through the end. We're not doing it that way. We are in a certain section each time, but people are free to bring up questions, comments, and so forth from any part of the book, and we jump around like that. And so I invite you to join us first, third, and fourth Tuesdays. So this is from the first of the 3 fascicles, Shoaku Maku, or rather Maka Hanya Harimitsu, which is Dogen's, I think it was his interpretation or translation and also his commentary on it. And we skip the actual fascicle of Dogen, assuming that you will read it. We go right into the commentary because we don't have time to discuss both the fascicle and the commentary. So we have chosen to focus on Uchiyama's comments each time. And now we're just finishing up Shoaku Makusa, which is the refraining from chapter, fascicle. And the last one will be Uji, which is one of my favorites. It's existent time or being time, or as Uchiyama Roshi translates it, living time. And many of you are familiar with that. We won't go into any of that. So I wanted to point out one of the characteristics of Uchiyama in the very first page of the very first section of commentary in the book. He has these little subheads, which is a device that I used in my books as well to allow you to scan the pages and decide if you maybe want to bother reading up to there because something more interesting is coming later on. He says, on this one, this is the very first one in the Hanya Haramitsu, he says, reality is prior to comparison. So let that sink in for a moment. Reality is prior to comparison. We also often say Zen is beyond thinking, but I like to think of it as before thinking, kind of a regression back to a natural state of mind, an original state of mind as you were when you were 2 or 3 years old. You didn't have much thinking going on. You didn't have much to think about, but you were there fully, all 5 aggregates, fully aware, and so forth. But you weren't doing a lot of comparison or thinking, categorization, and so forth. So he goes into Dogen Zenji talking about this, and that Dogen makes the most significant points in the beginning of his writing, and then he amplifies. And it's interesting right away. So we have this very serious realities prior to comparison. Oh boy. And then the second paragraph, he says, let us turn the ignition key and warm up the engine to prepare for listening. So this is one of those pithy, sort of down-to-earth comments bringing it into context, which Matsuoka Roshi is also known for. And then he goes into great depth on maha, as he says it, maha in Sanskrit, great or greatness, itself expresses the Buddha Dharma as a whole. The one word, maha, says the whole thing. And this is very Dogen-esque in that Dogen will take one thing, such as being time, existent time, or for the time being, and just sort of beat it to death, going through it again and again and again until he drives the point in. Then in the second one quote I want to pull out, so now we're into this really dignified, wonderful approach in the beginning, which already has a little flavor of a sense of humor to it. And then he goes into what does maha mean as a noun? As I often say, it means Buddha Dharma beyond comparison. So comparatively speaking, when we inquire in detail, it is impossible to judge whether something is big or small. For instance, we think a flea's testicles are small, but there must be some viruses that are parasitic on a flea's testicles, and for those viruses, a flea's testicles must be immeasurably vast. Here he goes again. So it's like a whiplash. Just when you least expect it, this thing is thrown at you by this Zen master. And then he goes on a little more serious about it. I think that's also a serious comment, but with our very sophisticated microscopes and telescopes, it is very hard to distinguish what is big and what is small. And he talks about a light year being big and so forth, and we can't grasp that. So what it makes me, reminds me of, and I often think of, I heard at some point that koans these days were often being answered with a quote from Alice in Wonderland or a quote from Through the Looking Glass. If you remember those tales of Hudson, take a bite of this cookie, you get small. Take a bite of this cookie, you get big, right? So I think it's getting at the same point that scale is a relative matter. Scale is an arbitrary thing. We have the English system of inches and feet and so forth, and we have the metric system. And we think of ourselves as 5'2" eyes of blue, or 6 foot in my case. But we don't really know what that means. And in the beginning of Being, Time, Existence, Time, he talks about a 16-foot Buddha. I think they're getting at the same kind of idea that I was sitting there one day in a long retreat. I can't remember where I was at the time. may have been at Okamura's place, or may have been here. Wasn't as far back as Chicago. But if you're familiar with the giant Buddha statue in Kamakura, Japan, you can see its head over the horizon as you're approaching the city. I don't know how many stories tall it is, but it's huge. I have no idea how they managed to make it, cast it in bronze and build it. Probably in sections or in pieces. But at one point I was sitting, and all of a sudden it was as if I were the Kamakura Buddha. I'm looking down, I'm in the eyeball of the Kamakura Buddha, looking out through the pupil of one eye, and looking down and seeing this body of the Buddha going all the way down to the ground, and people walking around down there, not quite the size of ants, but very small. So all of a sudden, scale flipped on me. It's like I had no idea how big this is. So that's the point I think he's getting at here. And all of these points we want to remember in Buddhism and Zen teachings in particular are points that we actually experience. They're not just conceptual ideas. So let me stop there for a moment and see if anybody has any comments so far. Gilji, I can't see the screen from here, so you'll have to do the monitoring. Okay, moving right along then. Forever hold your peace. A long time ago, this is a little bit further on. A long time ago, the famous tea master Sen Rikyu, who was from 1521 to 1591, asked a carpenter to put a nail on an alcove post to be used for hanging a ladle. After discussing where the best place would be, the carpenter made a tiny mark at a spot indicated by Rikyu. If he had hammered a nail right away, they wouldn't have had a problem. But after taking a short break, the carpenter couldn't find the mark. He asked Rikyu again to select a location. When Rikyu pointed to a spot, the carpenter found the small mark he had made the first time. This story means that even though we can put a nail anywhere on a post, if it is for a particular use, then there must be one best particular spot. This possibly made-up story is nevertheless quite interesting. Sawaki Roshi often said you can go in any direction, east, west, south, or north. Wherever you go, you are the self that is only the self. Then he goes on to say, herein lies true peace of mind. Yet peacefulness is not enough. Within that peace of mind, we have to aim at the best spot. This is prajna, wisdom. So he has this wonderful technique, which I think Matsuoka shared, of taking something ordinary that we all experience in one way or another and turning it into a learning point, a teaching moment, or possibility of seeing what Buddhism is pointing at from a very ordinary kind of perspective. So I was trained in the Bauhaus method of design, problem solving, problem definition, working with tools, with materials, media, all different kinds of processes. And one of my teachers in visual design was Eugen. He liked the name Eugen instead of Eugene. Dana, D-A-N-A, same as Donna. And another teacher who did the taught shop courses, how to use the tools, how to build things, and so forth, was rebuilding his bookcases. And Mr. Dana was visiting him. He was sitting there as he usually would with his legs crossed. He looked a little like Shelley Berman, very thin, very dapper, tweed coat, so forth, legs crossed. And he says, I think you ought to move that upright a quarter of an inch to the right. And the story goes, and then a year or so later, he comes back and visits again within the next year, and the shelves are all built now. He's sitting there and says, I see you didn't move that upright a quarter of an inch. So he was so highly trained, he could see that kind of, distance. We call it eyeballing something. It's interesting to try this. If you're wanting to measure something, see if you can do it without the ruler. See if you can do it without the tape measure first, and see how close you are when you measure it and check your own ability to eyeball something. So this same kind of training the eyes, training the ears in music, training the eyes, photography and drawing in this Bauhaus model are nothing more than training your eyes to truly see what you're seeing. And perspective systems and all that are similar. So I thought that was an interesting piece. And nowadays, he says, Swaki Roshi often said you can go in any direction, east, west, south, or north. Wherever you go, you are the self that is only the self. Jiko, in other words, which, by the way, is Zena's Dharma name. Here, nowadays, we say, wherever you go, there you are, right? So that's our kind of colloquial version of that. Really, at any time, anybody, just raise your hand. And I'm sure that
they can just speak up and say, I have a question.
Yeah, it's better because we don't have the gallery view. Just on, go ahead and just speak up. Say something. Say, I have a question. Okay. This one, the subhead is the boundless vast universe is nothing but one scene of my own life.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yep.
Somebody has a question.
You guys?
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. So whoever has the question, please ask.
Well, see.
Maybe on mute. Who is it?
I think you can go ahead, Roshi. Somebody said I have a question, and I don't know who it was.
Okay. This is a little more of an anecdotal comment here. It's just a cultural kind of issue. Our countries of origin, India, China, Japan, we know they're very different culturally. And in this one paragraph, he says, it seems Indian people had a tendency to categorize by counting. They even categorized different types of sneezing, which is something that would stand out to Uchiyama and would stick in his mind. Sutras were written like this, full of categories called Dharma numbers. Buddhist scholars treat Dharma numbers seriously and argue over their significance. Such arguing makes no sense. If we eliminate the numbers when we read the sutras, we can better understand Buddha Dharma. It is impossible to understand the Indian sutras as they are written, even if we study them our whole lives. So many things are repeated so many times, and the style is so complicated. Therefore, when I read sutras, I read them by ignoring the numbers and ranks. Creating hierarchical stages in our Zazen is rather odd. As Dogen said, Zazen is not step-by-step meditation, but merely the simple and easy practice of a Buddha, the realization of Buddha's wisdom. So we understand that in order to practice something, you don't need step-by-step, you don't need numbers, you don't need this and that and so forth. But if you're going to try to communicate it, you're going to try to teach, many of us have been teachers at one time or another, you have to break it into digestible bites. And so you might have to present it as if it is in stages or as if it is enumerated. I think of the enumeration in India, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the 12-fold Chain, the 52 stages, etc., on and on and on and on, were probably mnemonics. Remember, they were in an oral tradition. Nothing was written down. And so it's very difficult for us to sort of reverse plot, back plot our context back to that context and understand what was actually happening in the dynamic of practicing and learning Buddhism, what became later known as Buddhism. Buddha was not a Buddhist any more than Christ was a Christian. But what we now call Buddhism is what he initiated, And the enumeration, I'm pretty sure, was endemic to the culture. Apparently, Sanskrit was used to keep track of deals you'd make, or inventories of how many sheafs of grass you have. Buddha bought a sheaf of grass from a monk, from a vendor that night, and sat on a sheaf of grass. That tells you a little bit something about how the zafu is designed, and why the Japanese like to sit on grass, tatami mats, so forth. But remember, the enumeration is a mnemonic. It's a way of remembering something and a way of memorizing. Go through something and say, "Oh yeah, there were 15 of those. What I can't remember what the 15th one was," and so forth. So, but arguing about it certainly makes no sense at all. That's just a little bit more of a cultural insight, I think, that Uchiyama is giving us there. And as usual, he pulls no punches. He calls it like he sees it. So anybody have a comment around that one? Okay. You could all just shout out no. So further on, the donkey he's refraining and carrying out. This is the quote from Dogen. Refraining and carrying out. Remember, in that, if you've read that section, that fascicle, talks about refraining from evil and carrying out all good. This is one of the precepts, to do good for others and so forth. And refraining, it's interesting to set refraining and carrying out against each other. If you think of them, Dogen seems to do this with a lot of things. Like he says, to carry yourself forward and experience the myriad things is delusion. That the myriad things come forth and manifest themselves or experience themselves is enlightenment or awakening. So he seems to always be opposing one kind of action against another kind of action. So what he called the backward step, famously called the backward step, this is the way we think of it. It's the way we usually approach everything, carrying ourselves forward to experience that, whatever subject we're studying. Mike Goldman handling venomous snakes and so forth, is the opposite of what we do in Zen. We let it come to us. I was trained in research as well as design, consumer research, mostly for end user research for new product development, things like that. Although we did things like newspapers, and we had all kinds of clients in Chicago. And then after we moved to Atlanta, and that was the principle in research. You do everything you can to design the study in such a way that the moderator conducting the focus group or the individual one-on-one interview does nothing to bias the information. And it can come down to simple things like handling one of the projectives, like a vacuum cleaner handle or something that we're studying, too many times, or something the table picks up the emphasis on that. So you can distort the data if you're not careful. You can have an opinion about the subject under study, for instance. So we let it flow to us. The information flows to us without any inhibition or barrier. If otherwise, the information is going to be compromised. It's not going to be any good. So I think that's very similar technically to what we're saying when we do Zazen. We're letting this come to us. We're not going to it, because going to it influences it. There's an ancient Zen saying, a step toward it is a step away. So it's a very difficult place for human beings to go or to be. It's not normal. It's not our normal way of doing things. So refraining and carrying out.
So, Matsuoka was, kind of like, to me, when I read Matsuoka, like a cheerleader. Today we were talking about
Cheerleader.
Yeah. Well, we got stuck, or not saying we got stuck, but we talked a lot about the hair on fire.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, he says, practice in a wholehearted way.
Wholehearted.
All right. So, so you're saying let it come to us. Matsuoka would say, put everything into the set,
Yep.
everything.
Yep.
So it's almost like that is almost contrary.
Seems like it. Mm-hmm.
So how would you distinguish the two?
Well, the one is speaking to what you might call video effort or endurance. Don't let anything get in your way. Just jump in both feet, he would often say. And even though it seems like nothing is happening, you're failing. The monkey mind is busy beating you up over it. That is when it's getting good. When it's at its worst, like the last 10 yards of the 100-yard dash, when you think, I'm out of energy, I can't breathe, I'm out of oxygen, this is frustrating, I'm not getting anywhere, that's when you're close. Mm-hmm. They said there's something in Japan they call choda, C-H-O-D-A. I think it's hyphenated. Choda means fall up. He said you go along for a long time and you're getting more and more, nothing is happening, no progress, you're failing, right? And all the negativity starts to set in place. So that's when you persist, that's when you keep going, because pretty soon, if you don't give up, you will go through a chodai, you will fall up. But he said you fall up to the next plateau. The plateau is again flat. So you go on for a long period of time and think, well, now I've really screwed up. I'm not getting anywhere again. I can't do this. It works for everybody else. Maybe it doesn't work for me. All that kind of thinking sets in place. So one of the words he used more frequently than any other was encourage. To encourage yourself and don't discourage yourself and try to encourage others and so forth.
That's what he said. Like I said, he seemed like Matsuoka was kind of like an encourager, kind of like almost a cheerleader.
Cheerleader, yep.
Yeah. Be here, sit, be here. I mean, it's over and over.
He would say things like, Zen keeps the men younger and the women more beautiful. It's like a shameless pander to Zen, and so am I. So Zen is good for what ails you. It's whatever you want, you'll get from Zen.
Right.
So that's a good point. All encouragement. So refraining, it's the backward step, and carrying out. And we do have to act, as Okamura Roshi was pointing out. We can't just sit there 24/7. Refraining and carrying out are like the horse arriving before the donkey has left. Now, before we get into any discussion of what that might mean, remember, in their time, a donkey was something that did a lot of work for you. A horse was something you rode. You didn't have a car. You didn't have buses. You didn't have airplanes. You didn't have any of that. So a horse and a donkey are not chosen because of their functionality here. They're chosen symbolically. But I think when we read the word horse and donkey, it clicks in our mind. It's like, the Kentucky Derby. Well, there was no Kentucky Derby in those days. That's what horse means to us. I can bet on a horse for the Kentucky Derby. Or a donkey, I don't know what vision that conjures in your mind, but I used to walk by a farm in the third grade back and forth to school where there was a donkey, and I would always stop and visit the donkey. There could have been a jackass. We had a lot of jackasses in the neighborhood. So refraining and carrying out are like the horse arising before the donkey has left. The donkey, this commentary now, that was Dogen. The donkey symbolizes delusion, while the horse symbolizes enlightenment. It's a mistake to think that only after you have eliminated the various evils, that is, all delusions, then for the first time will enlightenment arrive. So it's almost one of the versions of emptiness that is defined as the emptiness of one thing not being in another. And so they would use a donkey and a horse. There's no donkey in the horse, and there's no horse in the donkey. I think a jackass, there's horse and donkey in them. I'm not sure. But it's a mistake to think that we get rid of delusion and then we're enlightened. And Dogen gets into this elsewhere where he says, those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. those who are greatly deluded, those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who have great delusion about realization are sentient beings. So this is saying great realization of delusion. And again, in design circles, it's you have to recognize the problem before you can begin to approach a solution. So when we begin recognizing delusion as it manifests in our awareness, we're now beginning to become Buddhas, meaning awake. We're waking up to the fact that the way we perceive our reality, our world, is delusive. It's necessarily delusive. Okamura Roshi was here one time, sitting right here talking to us. He's saying, I see you sitting in front of me, and I know the altar is behind me, but I can't see the altar. But I can turn around and see the altar, but then I can't see you. He used this simple example as a way of illustrating what he called incompleteness is the same as delusion, or it's the same as being in appearance or form, but missing the emptiness, missing the dynamic factor, and so forth. All of these so-called opposites, which are really complementary. One actually defines the other. So it's a mistake to think that only after you have eliminated the various evils, delusions, then for the first time all enlightenment will enlightenment arrive. We're already enlightened in that we're simply pursuing this. We have enlightened self-interest. One of the quotes I have from Matsuoka is, people go through life with something missing, and they come to Zen to find it. They don't know what it is, but they know it's missing, and so they go looking for it, like the ox herding pictures, looking for the ox, and so forth. Refining and carrying out are like the horse arising before the donkey has left. The donkey is a very stubborn thing. We don't even try to get rid of the donkey. It's like the monkey mind. If you try to fight the monkey mind, it will turn into a 600-pound gorilla. You're going to lose that fight. So we don't. We let it do its thing. We listen. We pay attention. So again, anybody have something on that?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
You know, it occurs to me that this notion of, of course, we read earlier today, there was a quote that gaining, when we think we're going to gain something, that's really we're losing. And when we lose, when we let go, then we gain, that principle. I think that really is interesting how that correlates with, taking the backward step. I think there's a correlation with Dogen's take the backward step, look the other way. We're all pursuing it the wrong way. Take the backward step. And also, when we study the Dharma, let's say we traditionally study the Dharma in sutras and various sources, generally speaking, we try to understand it. Of course, this is what we have habituated, and that's not necessarily. I don't think that's wrong, but to really understand it comes when you're not trying to understand it. I think so. I'm thinking this whole principle that you've touched on, I think, is quite pervasive in Buddhism and in reality to go beyond that.
Wonderful. Good. Yeah, I'm not picking on you here, but even Buddha did not understand this. So even when we use the word understand, and everybody uses it, Uchiyama uses it, Matsuoka Roshi used it, and Buddha, the translation says, the first noble truth that existence is suffering. We're to fully understand suffering in the world. But we have to question this word understand. It's beyond understanding. It's not that kind of understanding. And as you're saying, as it turns out, you could re-say what Uchiyama Roshi said. You could say gaining is losing. Losing is gaining. It's like the old thing of teach a person to fish instead of giving them fish. Anything you can give somebody takes something away from them, their ability to get it themselves, for instance. And this is, I know it's a political, social, that's not where I'm going with this. But on the other hand, if you take something away from somebody, it gives them an opportunity to get something from that. So we in design and artistic media kind of studies and practices, we have a very simple idea that they fall into two major classes, all media of all kinds. One is called additive. If you're putting clay on an armature to build a bust of Napoleon, that's called additive because you're adding material as you go. And then if you're chipping away the stone to reveal Rodin's thinker, that's called subtractive because you're taking material away to reveal the form that's left. And most people, I think, would regard Zen meditation, Zazen, as that kind of process where we're gaining or adding something. We're going to get new information. We're going to learn something. But I think those of us who've been in it for some time begin to realize it's subtractive. What we're doing is disabusing ourselves of our misconceptions, our confusion, our opinions. Mothers come into Dokusan, they say, oh, my kids are driving me crazy. I know I need to let go of that. I say, no, you don't. That's not the non-attachment the Buddha taught. Buddha taught the non-attachment to your opinion about that. You're mom. You're in for it. You're going to suffer. This is not about avoiding suffering. So it's about, but I think if we think of it simply mechanically as a process, and it's subtractive, all the baggage we carry in with us, we got a lot of baggage, and it takes a long time for us to recognize each bag. Say, oh, okay, I'm going to set that one down. And there's another bag. I can set that one down. I think that's a. I'm glad you brought that point up. We've got one here, Sandra Tonga.
Going back to what was the phrase you used? Buddhas understand delusion.
We are to fully understand the existence of suffering in the world, and then the later ones, we are to fully realize cessation and so forth. Fully, it was always we. Along with each teaching, he gave a challenge. Along with each of the Four Noble Truths, it was a challenge, what to do about it.
I was wondering about delusion, understanding delusion, whether it was a challenge or the word evil,
Suffering.
or suffering or anything. I think understanding that sometimes delusion is a challenge instead of an evil or stuff. There was something I read in a book by a mathematician, I can't remember his name, called The Art of Mathematics, where he was laying out the skills of mathematics. He said, but he understood that to him, his wife was the most beautiful person in the world. And that was kind of a delusion, but it was a perfect delusion, and it was not, it was something else. Positive. So it's not always an evil for a delusion, but we need to understand that.
So Dogen, according to the translator, used the word realization rather than understanding. Realization is not the same as understanding. And somebody said Zen is the pursuit of the understanding of meaning. And we also think of understanding and meaning as being the same. If I understand something, I know its meaning. But a couple of quick examples. We understand how to drive a car, but we don't know its meaning, which is, for one thing, is worldwide air pollution. Nobody understood that that was part of the meaning of driving a car, as Henry Ford and the others started the whole thing in motion. And then it just built to the point that it's out of control, way out of control. The meaning, one of the meanings of it, worldwide pollution. We have children, as if you have a son or a daughter, very meaningful event. Even a marriage to another person is a very meaningful event, but we really don't understand it. It's beyond understanding. So he uses the word realization. Realization is not make real. We don't make something real. We don't do this, but it becomes real. And he opposes manifestation to actualization in Zazen Shin. Actualization is something we can work on. We actualize, it's actualized through this meditation process. But the manifestation of it, all beings coming forth and experiencing themselves, we can't make that happen. We cannot do manifestation. We can practice actualization, but we cannot. It's like the Zazen, we can do Zazen. And there's the effect of Zazen. We cannot bring about the effect. Even Bodhidharma made this point. He said it's not necessary to do Zazen. And I would say it a little differently. I'd say it should not be necessary to do Zazen. Right? We should, and this was Dogen's question before he went to China. If this is true, what this sutra said, that all beings are endowed with Buddha nature, why is it so hard? Why do we have to do all this work? Why aren't we just all enlightened? And after he came back from China, he retranslated the lines to say, all beings are Buddha nature, not that they have it. Having it means you know it. So we can be something that we don't know. We call ourselves human beings. We call ourselves different races. We call ourselves male, female. We call ourselves all these names. But we have absolutely no idea what we are. So you can be something without knowing what it is or without knowing it. That was the conversion that Dogen had in China. Okay, enough on that. I hope it's not being too discursive here. I'm trying to stay focused. So this is in the section where he's talking about Kyoi, this poet, and
Hojo Kozan has his hand up to say something.
okay, sorry.
Just a reminder to everybody that at the Zendo in Atlanta, it's not on gallery. So you have to just go ahead and speak out when you have something to say. Go ahead, Kozan.
Okay. I was struck by your thinking about understanding versus realization. And it occurred to me that you can study physics. You can go to school and get a Ph.D. in physics. And you can say that that person understands physics. But an acrobat doesn't know anything at all about Einstein or Newton, but he has perhaps a realization of gravity that is not included in what the PhDs have. And perhaps if you make an idea of gravity and say, go out and find me a cup of gravity and bring it back here, may be an interesting koan, I suppose. But anyway.
Very good, Kozan. It's very much like Uchiyama's discussion of the teacup. And Matsuoka Roshi talked about the meeting of a Zen master and I think it was a Maharishi. And the Zen master was posing a question. Is this teacup in your mind or is it in my mind? Where is it? Where's this teacup? And the Maharishi failed really to answer the question adequately. And those questions, if you think about them, that conundrum goes right to the heart of physics. At one and the same time, we know both things can be true at the same time, which is a wonderful phrase that everybody's using these days, because it kind of unites duality and non-duality, even though the people using the phrase don't realize it. So both things can be true at the same time means that this monitor sitting in front of us, through which we're connecting with all of you and having this conversation, is at one and the same time perfectly real, and yet in another sense it's not. real in the sense that there it is, it's working, it's existing, it's functioning. But on the other hand, it is constantly changing, and in fact, it is deteriorating. And if we just let it sit there forever and did nothing with it, and came back and looked at it in a few years, it would have all fallen apart. It would have burned out, all different kinds of things. You include the energetic level of the electricity running through it, it would be worn out at some point. Those things both are true at the same time, and any high school kid understands there's more space than stuff in anything we call solid. But even in Buddha's time, they didn't have that kind of science. So Buddha would say, Ananda, space cannot enter an object. Any high school kid would say, wait a minute, wait a minute. And back to your point, goes on. When quantum theory came about, we had a wonderful physicist from Georgia Tech who used to come, David Finkelstein, a world-renowned physicist, and he would give us lectures. And one of them was on these three revolutions, Newtonian mechanics and relativity, and then quantum physics. And he made the point that they built on each other. One does not completely deny or get rid of the other one, but it builds on it. And he called them revolutions. And but he said nobody can understand quantum. Nobody understands quantum. It's not understandable, and you can't use the same language to talk about these different things. Buckminster Fuller, some of you know, is one of my mentors in the design realm. He called them each of these revolutions in physics higher and higher approximations to the reality. So I think there's a principle we can latch onto from science and say there's a kind of convergence there that in our Buddha Dharma practice, we've come to a higher and higher approximation of reality in our experience. But this is Matsuoka's plateau. It seems to be flat. It seems to be going nowhere. It works in subliminal ways. So take courage. Be encouraged. Thank you very much for that, Kozan. So he's talking about this poet, Kyoei, and he's talking about Dorien, the master. This exchange that they had that you may have read or heard about, where Kyoei says something, it's about this refraining and from bad deeds and so forth. He said, well, even a 3-year-old child can say that. And Dorian responds and says something like, yes, but even an 80-year-old man can't carry it out. And so he goes into great detail on this, but however, refrain from various evils and carry out acts of good as a teaching of Buddha Dharma. Wait, let me read it a little bit before this. Although Haku Kyoei, that's the poet, came from a long bloodline of military men and was known as a truly great poet, when it came to the Buddha way, he was just a beginner. He probably just thought that Dorien was simply saying, quote, be good and don't do bad things, close quote, as some sort of moral or ethical admonition. However, refrain from various evils and carry out acts of good as a teaching of Buddha Dharma has nothing to do with ethics or morality or being, quote, good in the social sense. Buddha Dharma has nothing to do with the absolute life of Jiko facing outward and deliberately choosing to do so-called good or evil, rather as an all-comprehensive Jiko, true self, Jiko, without any comparing of self and others, refraining from various evils and carrying out acts of good is the internal structure of the actuality of the life force. In other words, it's just being normal or being natural. And what we've been talking about just prior to this is how countercultural and even counterintuitive this practice is. Everything in the educational system works the other way. It's all carrying oneself forth to experience the myriad things. So this is not easy. It's a form of cognitive dissonance, you could say. You might say. We're a little over halfway through. And we can turn 10 minutes over, right? Saving Matsuoka for last in case we run out of time. This the subhead here is the Buddha way is the gate of repose and quiet joy. By the way, they say the samadhi of action, this is in the martial arts, the samadhi of action is 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times greater than the samadhi of repose. But just as we were saying, there's a process of subtraction. Non-attachment is divesting yourself of your own opinion. In order to arise to the level of the samadhi of action in the martial arts, most people need the samadhi of repose. And Matsuoka Roshi was a black belt judo, as some of you know. And he said if you had Zen, you could defeat an opponent with superior waza technique. So you can have an opponent who's actually better than you at this art, martial art, but you could defeat them because you had Zen. So there's something about this repose, so-called repose, sitting in zazen, deep physical samadhi, which as Zinku was mentioning the other day, is followed by mental samadhi. Physical samadhi is the balance in the posture. Coming in alignment with gravity, I think it's a physical principle primarily, that our nervous system, everything comes in perfect alignment with gravity. So we sink into equilibrium, equipoise, where everything is totally balanced, as if we're floating in space. And we literally, we're floating in space. The skeleton is floating in the muscle mass. When this comes about, there is this sense of stepping off the pole, the 100-foot pole, or jumping into the abyss, like vertigo, a loss of gravity. Gravity seems to disappear. So equipoise, coming into this repose, seems like, oh, it's comfortable, we're going to fall asleep. Many people start falling asleep. I think of Zazen as falling asleep, staying awake. We let everything fall asleep, but we stay awake and pay attention to what happens. And so when we come into repose, it's not at all quietistic or silent. It's noisy. It's threatening. It feels like vertigo. It feels like you're falling, which we're falling through space. The planet is falling through space and so forth. So it's dizzying. Matsuoka Roshi, in one of his early instructions, little pamphlet he handed out, he said, when you feel dizzy, concentrate on your knees. When you feel nauseous, concentrate on your forehead. I think that's the way it was. Stuart Zinker can, Test Center Zinker can verify that. So this says, in Zazen, you're going to feel dizzy. You're going to get dizzy. In Zazen, you're going to get nausea. Why? Because you're coming into alignment with gravity in such a way that everything comes into perfect balance, equipoise, or what he called sitting mountain feeling. Very stable, but if you're sitting in that stability for long enough, it goes away. You adapt. What we're doing in Zazen is a profound process of deep sensory adaptation. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out, what's going to happen if you sit still enough, long enough, and straight enough. So repose is kind of deceptively simple. It's not really repose in the sense that we mean resting and so forth. Let me read the quote quickly from Dogen. In every respect, Buddha Dharma heard for the first time from a wise teacher or heard many years later as a result of authentic practice will be the same. This is called right from the beginning, right at the end, or subtle cause, subtle effect. It is also referred to as, quote, Buddha cause, Buddha effect. So you have to conjecture, if I do sit still enough, long enough, straight enough, what is going to be the effect of that? What's going to happen? What's likely to happen? Here we go with Uchiyama again, and this is very self-effacing as is his nature. Usually it is my nature to poke fun at or belittle the various things I see going on around me. Pretty honest. And yet somehow the more I study and practice Buddha Dharma, the more impressed I become regarding how wonderful it is. I find it incredible that this teaching of Buddha Dharma pursues the ultimate truth of human life. Perhaps it is because there has been a continuation of the pursuit of the truth of human life in all its facets, beginning with Shakyamuni Buddha in India, and then carrying on with either other magnificent people spreading to China, Japan, and elsewhere. This calls to mind a quote from Sensei where at one point he says, perhaps we'll have to hire an army of psychics to figure out what actually happened in the history of Zen. Because the record is not going to be there. The record is going to be destroyed. All the details, you're never going to get at it. Perhaps we'll have to hire an army of psychics. To me, their sense of humor is very, very much the same. Moving right along. Just shout out if you want me to stop. I'll pause. This is important. We often lament that we're not living in those wonderful times that Dogen lived in or Buddha lived in. Everything was so idyllic. All you have to think about is they didn't have plumbing to understand that it wasn't that idyllic. And he says this clarification. This is where studying history, what do we say, those who do not, of course, have to repeat it. During Dogen Zenji's period as well, here and there. Well, before this, he's talking about his in Japan, all of the suffering that he went through and Japan was going through at that time and so forth prior to the war. During Dogen Zenji's period as well, here and there were volcanic eruptions. I guess Mount Fuji was alive or active at one time. I'm not sure it is now or not. There were volcanic eruptions and continued poor harvests. It was recorded that piles of dead bodies, victims of starvation, could be seen all along the dry bed of the Kamo River. Even during those times, Dogen Zenji is said to have continued sitting zazen. And then he goes into, there's even a related story about the Buddha Shakyamuni and things going on in India at that time. So we look around and we see Ukraine and we see the insanity of human beings inflicting suffering upon human beings and animals and the rest of the planet, the stewardship of the planet and so forth. And now Mother Nature is pissed and she's coming back at us pretty hard. We may not survive this one. People are speculating about that. But we think times are terrible now. But that's because we're not students of history. Times have always been terrible. We think the pandemic was, well, we've seen several incidences of pandemic in recorded history. And there was one at the time of Dogen. It appears there was a pandemic that wiped out 2/3 of the population of Japan, they estimate. Compare that to what we have seen, COVID, and it looks not quite a walk in the park, but this is a known issue. Zen is nothing if not practical, and I think we have to keep that in mind as we are approaching our Zen practice. Then talks about life and death, and he says, we get the feeling culturally, again, these are culturally counterintuitive, the focus of Buddhism on suffering, aging, sickness, and death. And as I say in my Dharma Bites and other places, I think what we're seeing politically is a manifestation of the inability of modern human beings, at least, to embrace aging, sickness, and death. If you look at Donald Trump, he looks like the poster boy for suffering. And he looks like he's doing everything he can to avoid embracing the natural process of aging, sickness, and death. And he's not alone. Everybody seems to be trying to run from it. In Buddhism, we embrace it. We turn around and face it like the monster in the nightmare. Turn around and face it.
Yeah, but I wonder, it seems like 2,500 years ago, aging, sickness, and death, I mean, the Buddha probably had to walk over people that were in lepers and whatnot that were in his environment. Now, sickness, they have all sorts of medications, and if we get sick enough, they put us in a nice sanitary space that's out of sight from the rest of us, old folks' homes or whatnot.
Right.
Aging, you got Viagra and Botox, and death doesn't seem to be present. I mean, we see death on televisions, and from time to time we have to experience death with someone in our families, and we dress them up like they're going to a party and kind of go visit their corpse. But I don't think we're anywhere close to being in contact with those things now.
Right. In the history of even just lunch meat, you go buy lunch meat at the store, it's nicely packaged, it's all clean and sterile, and you bring it home. You don't see the pig being hit in the head with a sledgehammer and gutted and hung up to dry, bleed out. You don't see that. You don't experience it. And so there's all kinds of anomalies like that. And we've built barrier after barrier after barrier between us and reality. And it's not a healthy thing. But in Buddha's time, those were remember the four views or the four visions he had when he finally escaped the compound. He saw the old person for the first time. So he recognized aging. He saw a sick person on the street or whatever for the first time. He'd been shielded from this intentionally by his parents, according to the story, by his father. And then he sees a corpse. He sees a body. They had open bone grounds, charnel grounds in those days. The bodies would lie out and rot, apparently. They had all different kinds of processes. And then he saw a monk. He saw somebody in a robe. In an unusual outfit, looked like, okay, there's a way to approach all of this. So Buddhism is not an avoidance technique for avoiding suffering. It's a way of embracing it as natural. But societally, I think this is part of the problem, is that we have such aversion to aging, sickness, and death that results in all kinds of neurotic and psychotic behavior. Thank you, Kozan. Well, I suppose that's why they have difficulty talking about it and avoid looking into it. People today, particularly followers of Buddhism, even when they do bring it up, they seem to have this gloomy way of expressing it. But I don't bring up the subject of death because of some nihilistic or pessimistic view of life. Everything that is born, lives, and dies. That's why I bring it up. As I often say, birth is the leading cause of death. And it's hard to separate the two. Dogen says, birth is an expression, complete this moment. Death is an expression, complete this moment. They're like winter and spring. You do not call winter the beginning of spring or summer the end of spring. So it begs the question, birth is an expression of what? Death is an expression of what? So you could say life in the larger sense, perhaps, right? Birth is an expression of life. We celebrate birth. Death is an expression of life. We mourn death. Doesn't make any sense. They're inflection points in the same continuum of life. It's natural. It's the way it is. Who are we, God, to say that this is not good? I could design this better. I could do a better job than this. So people today think only about survival and so forth, and he goes on and on and on. Just surviving is a wonderful thing, but talking about death is unlucky, so it's inauspicious. Anyway, we don't want to dwell on this morbidly. It's not a morbid focus. Some old Zen master said, stamp life and death on your forehead and never let it out of your mind. Not morbid, it's reality. Reality check, as we like to say these days.
And Uchiyama said it's an absolute reality that we have to come to terms with, and if we don't, we will suffer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
An open-handed thought.
Right. So then this goes back to and touches on something we saw in the Okamura film with his son. He talked to me about his son early on, and about his son sitting there playing games all day on the so forth. I told him my son has had similar problems. Haven't worked out too well, but I think it was Khalil Gibran who said, "Your children are not your children. Your parents are not your parents." Now, I don't think he meant that you can neglect them or that you shouldn't try to take care of them and do your best, but they have their own life. We've heard of smother mother, smother love, and so forth, where you try to assume the stewardship of somebody else's life, if it's your spouse or a child or whatever. Some people need help and you need to step in, but you don't want to get confused that you're doing this because it's your right to do so or something of that nature. I look at it as we can only be 50% responsible for any relationship, no matter how intimate, because that other human being is 50% responsible. Sokean said this in New York when the Titanic went down. He said everyone who went down with that ship was 50% responsible for their own death. This caused a big stink because that ship was not supposed to sink. The cream of the crop of New York was on it going to Europe, and all these rich, wealthy, elite people went down with the ship. The women were allowed to bail out in the lifeboats, if you recall the story. And he ran into a lot of flack for that. He published a column in a paper in New York. And he said, look, he said, we're responsible for our own birth. So we are responsible for our death, no matter how it happens. If somebody walks up and shoots you in the head, you're still responsible because you're responsible for your birth. But you're only 50% responsible. The other person is also 50% responsible. And even if you forgive somebody for doing you harm, that does not absolve them of their karma in Buddhism. You certainly cannot have a priest absolve you of your sins, as in some religions.
They call it you reap what you sow.
You reap what you sow. So this is about, this is a wonderful kind of passage from Uchiyama, I think, about children and how you try to or don't try to control their life. There's no need to force studying on a child who just isn't into it. Many of my, and Okamura Roshi has got to be aware of this teaching, right? He helped translate this. So it would be countercultural to see what we saw in that film, to allow your son to drop out of school, 12 or 13,
Yep.
and just do what he wants to do. Any other parent would be tearing their hair out and getting psychiatrists involved and maybe drugs, treating the child. This child is something wrong. We have to fix it. There's no need to force studying on a child who just isn't into it. Many of my disciples are quite promising. From the time they were in high school, They looked around at most of the colleges and universities and realized how ridiculous they all were. They figured that they would be better off becoming monks and came to Antaiji. Thinking that your child is especially gifted just because he or she comes home with a good report card is the same as thinking that a goldenrod is the same as a redwood tree. A young redwood sapling will grow perhaps a very small amount a year. A goldenrod will sprout in the spring, and by summer it will have grown over 2 meters. But by fall, there's no trace left of the goldenrod at all. Parents today just seem so foolish, putting all their effort into raising goldenrods. The next generation will be a whole generation of goldenrods, and the redwood sapling will all get trampled underfoot. My whole intention here in Antaiji is to have an environment where I can raise redwoods that will someday become truly valuable trees. So I think of our Zen practice as taking the long view. We hopefully look at the big picture. We're at 8 o'clock already.
8:12.
Was this supposed to end at 8?
Or 8:30.
8:30, okay.
Well, I mean, I think the
Take the schedule.
Yeah, you're good till a half hour. I do have a comment on what you just said, what you just read. I thought that was really interesting too. You know, one of my favorite quotes is,
Zenku, you're muted.
oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I thought I unmuted everyone. But anyway, I have a comment, Roshi, on your last
Okay.
offering. And one of my favorite quotes was from Black Elk Speaks, the book, a collection of his talks and his history. Quite an interesting book, but one of the things that he said that I never forget, just really knocked me out. He said, kind of early on in the book, he says, I was very fortunate. I never went to school. And so he lived with his grandparents, and his grandparents, in that way, they could teach him the traditional ways, and he didn't have to get all the indoctrination of Western thinking and
Right.
on and on. And so he cited that as,
Yes.
you know, one of the best things that ever happened to him. And I really thought that was fantastic.
Right. On the other thing, I think we have to be optimistic about the nature of the Buddha nature, that it can survive even intense schooling.
I had the experience in life. Where originally, I thought that my parents gave up on me when I was 12 about my education because they stopped looking at my grades and everything when I was 12. I found out when I was 35 from my mother that the teachers had called him in to talk to him when I was 12 years old, and said I needed a much different education than they were able to give. And he didn't know what to do about that. He couldn't send me to private school or anything, so he let me go. And like Okamura, I chose what I studied from then on. I would have liked more guidance about what to focus on, yet taking the hands off and following the natural path for me for how I would educate myself has made all the difference in the world to me. And you just don't know. You need to let your children develop who they are.
And we have this modern phenomenon of homeschooling, which can kind of go either way, I think. You know, it can be worse than going to school in the conventional sense, or it might be better, depending on the parent.
I was once a lay counselor at this large church, and when we were talking about kids, they taught us that that they're the best recorders but the worst interpreters. If you notice, though, Okamura's son, he got emotional, and you just said that you wanted more. So a child, if the parents never say anything, then they would uh, interpret that as being rejected, that the parents don't care, and they don't care about me.
Yeah.
So I kind of, when I watch, and I've seen that video before with Okamura and his son, and it's kind of like, yeah, you can let them go, but then, if you notice, he even said, it'd be nice to have some guidance. It'd be nice that he didn't say this, but it's almost like he was saying, it'd be nice if he cared what I did.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, again, Okamura was, doing something else.
Right.
But yeah, that's the interpretation of the child.
Well, two things about that. I think Okamura was demonstrating by his own example
Mhm.
what his son should learn from him. And the sister was working very much with her brother. But one thing I noticed is they weren't telling him things to do. They weren't making declarative statements. They were asking him questions. The mother was commenting in such a way that you could see that she was not going to take the path of trying to tell him how to straighten out and fly right and so forth.
But I'm only saying what it looked like, how the son was interpreting what was going on, which was, again, the worst interpreter. So, I think parents have to somewhat communicate something.
Yes.
Yep.
More communication.
There's a difference between, I think, forcing and allowing one to choose and being there to get feedback.
On screen, you can see that Yoji talks with his hand. All they could see was your hand flying around.
Sorry.
This is Katsuryu. I have a comment also. This thing about being fortunate that he didn't go to school. A school for a Native American person meant the removal of his culture and his family.
Right. Right. And in a sense, it does, for all of us. But I maintain, and again, Joji, I'm not attacking your comment. I think in our meditation in particular, when we start getting small or we start getting large or everything starts changing in what is the most familiar thing that we carry, our own consciousness. In design, we say, or art, we say, making the familiar strange is the way of defining creativity. You look at the Super Bowl every year, you watch the ads, they sell the same old beer, the same old cars, but everybody watches to see what creative thing they did to sell the beer, sell the cars differently this year. What did the creative teams do in the advertising agencies? So it's the same old thing, but it's what you do that is different with it. So creativity is making the familiar strange. That's one definition. There are many. But the most familiar thing we have is our consciousness. If you sit still enough long enough, it starts changing and it becomes strange. And that can be unnerving. And so I think there's an unfortunate aspect to modern science compared to Buddhist time or Dogen's time, that we can explain away a whole lot more things than they could. And as I said, the high school kid knows about relativity. Matter is energy, and so forth. They didn't know that. So when something started happening in their meditation, if you want to look into this, read the Sharingama Sutra, where Buddha goes into great descriptive detail. Something starts happening to their awareness in their meditation. They interpreted it with the cultural memes of the time, and Buddha interpreted it with the cultural memes of the time, and was telling them what it meant, and basically saying, don't get stuck, don't stop there, you're not enlightened, you're not done yet. You got a long way to go, just keep going, in other words. So I think one of the problems is we interpret too much. We insist on interpreting our experience while we're having it and explaining it away to ourselves. So I suggest that interpretation is that knee-jerk impulse that you want to start not suppressing, but letting go of that. Stop interpreting. Keep interpreting your experience. Because if you interpret it, you're going to be interpreting it in the context of concept. You're going to be using concept to try to control percept, conception to modify perception. Buddha even taught this. He said the mind imposes a false stillness on reality. It's imposing a false stillness on reality for purpose of survival. In the jungle, you have to know if that animal is running at you or running away from you. If everything is moving, it's harder to tell. Okay, so it's talking about the quick quote from Dogen. The ancient Buddhists have said that at birth all are born as lions. Here, a lion refers to the power of a tathagata. Tathagata means a thus come one who apprehends thusness or suchness, the way things really are. Somebody asked, I think it was guy who wrote Crooked Cucumber. I'm losing his name right now. He's a good friend. He asked Suzuki Roshi, kept trying to pin him down. He said, what is this about? And at one point he said, everything changes. But he also said, it's right out there. Tathagata is the thus come one, suchness. Let them know. So Uchiyama says, from the moment I gave out my first cry as a newborn baby, I've been living out the true reality of life. This is why it is said, Shakyamuni took 7 steps in the 4 directions and declared, in the heaven or on the earth, I alone am the most precious. This is what this little statue that pointing to the heaven, pointing to earth that we use for Buddha's birthday celebration. What he meant by this is that a single universe of all over all divided by all, had been born in his person and in our person. There are some foolish people who say that this passage shows how arrogant Shakyamuni was, but such a complaint just shows that they themselves are only looking from the view of one over all, from their own perspective, in other words. So this posits that we all come into this life, in a sense, in the same way. And we are all the same as Buddha. And I don't think we can use the excuse of conditioning of schooling getting in our way. He apparently was what some would call a spiritual overachiever. He had a lot of schooling from different groups. He would transcend that group and move on to another one. So he was full of all of his own baggage when he sat down that night, somewhere around 33 years old. First thing he had to do was divest himself of all of his, admit to himself in all humility, he did not know what he fundamentally needed to know. He knew a lot, just as we know a lot, but it's not what we need to know. So then toward the end of Shok Maksa, he comes to this comment. He goes back and says, as Dogen says, though an old man may not be able to carry out those words, that is refraining from evil and doing good, how is one unable to carry them out? In other words, how far can we go in explaining the depth and complexity of being unable to practice Dorin's words? What makes us think we're unable to carry them out? So he says, here I strive with all I can to explain the depth and intricacies of Buddha Dharma. I strive to understand it, to express it, to winnow through the intricacies of it, to say all I can about it. That is the sense of, quote, in this way, based on practice, we must winnow through just what Buddha Dharma is, understand it, and express it as fully and clearly as we can. That is, you have to make it your own. So again, in Buddhism, experiential truth is the only truth, actually. Conceptual truth or scientific truth that can be proven by others are the truth based on a belief which requires no evidence or inferior to direct experiential truth, which Buddha defined as identifying with the truth. Identifying with the truth. If the truth is emptiness, the way we, quote, understand that is by identifying with emptiness. We are emptiness. You are empty. I am emptiness. This is emptiness. That's why I maintain that the question in Buddhism is not who or why, it's not how. Why is the religious or philosophical question? How is the scientific question? The question in Zen is what? What is this that thus comes? What is this? And one answer is, if anything is emptiness, this too is emptiness, whatever you understand by emptiness. I'm going to run through a bunch of quotes very quickly to wrap up. These are, I'm not going to, I may have to stifle myself or not be able to not comment on something, but let me run through these. One of the first things Matsuoka Roshi said to me, I told him about LSD and was talking to a lot of students down at the Art Institute, down from bad trips and the University of Illinois, and talked to him about my LSD experience. And he said, and by the way, there's a talk called Zen and LSD that he gave at the YMCA. We haven't been able to find it. I was there to answer questions, so I know it was given. I know what he said. But he said, well, maybe you'll be my LSD master and I'll be your Zen master. Everybody else was freaking out about it. The other one Zen master said he would burn the temple down if he caught anybody smoking marijuana. Matsuoka Roshi wasn't concerned. He would say the desire that brings you to the Zen temple is a good desire. And again, the thing I said about something missing. And manifesting doubt, great doubt. And he said, Zen is spiritual confidence in everyday life. Confidence in everyday life, or spiritual confidence. I'm not going to go into detail of what I think he means by spiritual confidence. It's not the same as normal confidence. And then this, there was a Zen master and a televangelist again, where the dialogue was going on and on. The televangelist was waxing on and on about, yes, sometimes I am filled with God and I could feel God's presence and so forth. And the Zen master said something like, don't worry, pretty soon God go away. And this wasn't Matsuoka, somebody else. And the televangelist said, oh, no, God will never go away. He said, I know someday I will go away, but God will never go away. And the Zen master said, you go away and God go away, no difference. And he said to me one day, we were working around the temple there, and he took his fist and he touched his stomach and pointed to my stomach. He said, you and me, communication on this level. He took me aside one day and said, you must become a Zen priest, not for yourself, but so that others will listen to you. We live in a credential society. Credentialing in society is important. If you don't have credentials, they won't listen. And later, I had a lot of problems in life, and I came to him. I said I was wanting to quit, and he said, never give up your priesthood, no matter what. In retrospect, I think he was right. Then he also said, you will enlighten thousands. And he said, your enlightenment, he meant everybody's, your enlightenment will be even greater than Buddha's. People asked me what I thought he meant by that. And I said, I think he means the 2,500 years count. Not only there's an accumulation of wisdom, you might say, almost a racial or species thing, but it's also the accumulation of cultural evolution. If we can cut through all the crap that we're floating in here today, with all the complexity of the way we live compared to Buddha's time or compared to Dogen's time, that's going to be a big effing deal. If you can cut through all of this and get down to this same basis that they all got down to, that's going to be something. We were cleaning one day, and he had this box of cloths that he'd cut into about 5 or 6 inch squares. I'd never seen cleaning cloths that small. There was a whole box of them. And he dropped one in the kitchen, and he bent down, picked it up, and said, very precious, picked it up. I caught that. And he would say things like, I like to keep it empty around here, keeping all the clutter down, keeping everything, so nothing interferes with your mind. Later, I was in Long Beach, and I brought this incident up in talking with his students in Long Beach. And I told him how that struck me, how that stuck with me all of these years. And we asked him about it. He said he didn't remember it. But he would use a ton of napkins in a restaurant. He would wash his tableware in the water and wipe the forks and spoons and things off. He was very fastidious that way. And I think he was trying to control possibility of disease. One of the reasons he moved to Long Beach is so he could run in the sand on the beach, and he had terrible hay fever. His eyes would water and itch, and he would take Vaseline and put it on his finger and rub his eyeball with his finger with Vaseline. It was a horrible thing to see. But in Long Beach, he didn't have the pollen like we have in Chicago. And he would say things like, some people like to see pretty things. Some people like to hear pretty things. I like to eat pretty things. So presentation in the Japanese food was very important. He ripped a restaurant owner a new one here in Japanese for throwing the spinach in a bowl and putting the sesame in it instead of rolling it and cutting it and doing all the things they do. He and I were walking down to the seminary restaurant one morning after Zazen, around noon, to go to lunch, which we did frequently once in a while. There's a seminary north of the center on Fulton there near Halstead near Fulton. And we'd been out drinking sake and beer with dinner last night, and I said I had a hangover from that. And he said, "Oh, not much wisdom here." He didn't have a hangover. And he also said he would hold up the teacup and say, "No alcohol." That is a sake cup. He'd hold up a sake cup of sake and say, "No alcohol." He claimed that D.T. Suzuki, who he traveled with and was a student of his, taught him to drink beer because Suzuki had some kind of stomach problem, and he claimed the beer helped. He also said, if you drink and don't get drunk, there's a problem. About Zazen, he said, it looks like a mountain, but actually it's a volcano. In other words, there's a caldera building. It's going to come through. It's going to blow its top like Mount St. Helens one day. They also, when asked about engaged Buddhism, which as some of you know, is a big kind of sub-movement within American Zen, he said, this is the most you can do, taking the Zazen posture. He said, this is the most you can do. And he described our condition as being like a rat in a burning house. And it was about anger. It was about anger reacting in anger to everything. He said the rat runs this way, runs into a wall of flames, runs back the other way, another wall of flames. Pretty soon the rat is trapped in the corner with the flames closing in all around. What does the rat do? So you can answer that in a variety of facet or flip ways and say, well, jump into the fire, or, whatever. But one thing is sure, the rat is pissed off. The rat cannot control this. It's the burning house of Buddha, Buddha's burning house. So this is the true source of our anger, even though we blame it on everything else. You were very angry about things when you were 5 years old. You were angry about different things when you were a teenager. You were angry about different things when you were a parent, and so forth. Same anger, which proves the point that it isn't coming from what you identify it with. It's coming from a true source. And then just an anecdotal thing, he came to Atlanta in 1975 to perform Diane and my wedding. We were out in a woodsy area. I'm carrying around the Buddha statue, trying to find a place to put it, and sweating. It was hot and humid. So we do the wedding, and he wants to go back to his hotel. And so I said, sure, okay. We had a Volkswagen bus at the time. So we go jump in the bus. I'm in the driver's seat, and he's on the passenger side, and we go tearing off down the expressway to take him back down into the Emory Village to his hotel. And along the way, people are pulling up alongside us and pointing at us and waving and doing things like that. And I'm wondering, what the hell is going on here? So when we get to the hotel, we get out and we see that the back says just married, and there's things hanging off the back of the bus. Matsuoka and I are driving home just married. That was the story of our life. I could go on forever. Start me up and never stop. But I'll just now. So, any further question, and then we'll do the Dharma closing verse. We can go right into the Tisarana if everybody would like to join us tonight, and then we'll be done. Let's do the closing verse first. Any comments or follow-up, anyone? Just shout out. That's it.
I wasn't sure if you said shout out or shut up.
Shout out. Give us a shout out.
Thank you, Sensei, for bringing it's such a beautiful interplay, between Uchiyama and Sensei Matsuoka Roshi, and bringing Matsuoka Roshi back to life.
You remember him very well. For those who don't know, Matsuoka Roshi stayed with Tesen during the last years of his life. During a decline, he finally had to be moved to a extended care facility, and we would visit him, bring him unagi eel, which inagidan, which is his favorite Japanese meal. People from here, Tom Edwards, for instance, went up to Chicago just to visit him. And he was taken care of by, I think, Japanese people, so it was fairly comfortable for him. And he was extremely bright and present I wasn't there when he died, but it was amazing. He was physically deteriorating, but he was not mentally deteriorating at all. And thanks to Tessin, he had a wonderful home to stay in and people to take care of him. And I know you went through a lot for that, Tessin. We forever owe you a debt of gratitude.
Thank you for your kind words, but I feel what I was able to learn, what came to me was 1,000 times more than anything that I put out. But thank you for your kind words.
You were very fortunate at the same time.
Yes.
That's not the way it is. Both can be true at the same time. He could be a pain in the neck.
And we all.
Someday you'll have to tell everybody about Polly Pie,
For
Long Beach.
for next year's festivities, maybe.
Where did he like to go in Chicago? What was his favorite restaurant?
Well, basically any good Japanese restaurant, like when he was here.
You remember that
Where-
the woman that he liked so much, and they were sort of good friends? I can't remember her name, Key or something like that, Japanese.
Yeah, that's when he was still living here, because when
Yeah.
he came back, she had closed that restaurant. But there were some other
Do you happen to know what happened to her? I do.
I talked to her as she was closing her store on
Right.
Clark Street. And I think she was moving like to California or something. I think her husband had passed away and so forth.
Since I came here one time, and we decided to go out to a Japanese restaurant, and I found one over near the museum, the High Museum, and we go there, and it's her. She moved here, and she opened a Japanese restaurant here. That was really serendipity. It was amazing.
Kind of like the Enzo, right?
Yep. Okay, anyone else? Zenku-san, anybody?
No, I'm good here. Thank you so much.
Okay. We'll close with the 4 vows as usual, and then we'll go right into the Tisarana. So please stay with us for that.